The money-making bonanza that came from simply sitting on black gold appears to be over. How are the world's biggest oil-producing region, particularly the Gulf, trying to diversify and change their economies? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Putting all of your efforts into one thing, all of your eggs into one basket, works when it happens to be making you money. But what happens when demand, in this case for oil, dries up? Gulf countries are finding out.
After the oil boom of the 20th century, Gulf economies have grown rapidly, making Gulf citizens very wealthy. Throughout the region, oil wealth has built some of the world's most impressive cities. But it's drying up, and the world is moving away from fossil fuels. There's an oil glut, and the price per barrel is less than half what it was 10 years ago. Rich Gulf countries are being pushed to diversify their economies. Can they ditch their dependency on oil? 2008 saw the price of oil at a record high, $157 a barrel, after 7 years of near continuous rise. But the price never fully recovered after the financial crash and fell again in 2014. By 2016, a barrel was down to $29. Unsettling government balance sheets in oil-dependent countries. The IMF's 2017 economic outlook for countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council saw their GDP growth drop from 2.2% in 2016 to 0.5% in 2017. In the face of a post-oil world, GCC countries are trying to reform their economies. Saudi Arabia has launched its Vision 2030 agenda. It will see the petroleum giant increasing non-oil industry trade and focusing on public sector industries and consumer products.
كما نجحت البرامج الحكومية في تقليص الاعتماد على النفط يصل إلى نسبة 50%.
But diversification is high on the agenda of all the GCC countries. The United Arab Emirates is seeking to emerge as a business hub while investing in tourism, infrastructure and technology. Diminishing demand for oil could see Gulf countries struggling to adapt. In a region where the lifestyles of many citizens are subsidized by oil dollars, can Gulf nations make the right structural changes to ensure their economies flourish in a world that is becoming less reliant on oil?
Very pleased to say that joining us via Skype from Oxford, we have Adeel, Malik, a research fellow in economics at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies. With me, actually at the round table, we have Cornelia, Meyer, an oil and gas specialist and the CEO of Meyer Resources. Also here, Ian Black, a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Centre. He was the former Middle East editor for The Guardian newspaper. And I'm pleased to say we have Sambit Bhattacharyya from the Department of Economics at the University of Sussex. So if anybody knows, these people will know. So let me go first of all to you, Adeel. It's not a question of can they diversify necessarily. It's must they, in my opinion. What do you think?
Yes, of course. I mean, diversification is an urgent imperative in the Middle Eastern context. And if there was any time when the need for this is really felt, is today. But I must remind you that diversification has remained on the policy agenda for a very long period of time. In fact, if you were to read Iraq's 1950s development plans or the early development visions in many of these Gulf countries, diversification was a key aspect of that development agenda. And I think if it hasn't happened, it's not because rulers did not want it to happen or that there was not enough of an incentive. Is partly because of the politics of diversification. The World Bank, the IMF, a whole range of institutions emphasize the need for diversification and to import the best blueprints from Botswana and Norway and other countries. But the political challenge of diversification hasn't been addressed. And that political challenge, quite simply, is the following. It is that if you create independent sources of income from a private sector that is genuinely independent, it can spill over into politics. And that's something very difficult to rule of.
See, Adeel was pointing out the problems with it, and perhaps in his opinion why it hasn't happened until now. But it's pretty essential, isn't it?
Oh, I think it's especially
And we're talking
essential
mostly
now.
about Saudi Arabia, aren't we?
Let's just start with the kingdom. It's essential now for two reasons. You saw that oil prices didn't quite do what the oil producers wanted them to do over the last 2 years or so. It's now
creeping up.
recovering. It's
Yeah.
creeping up now. But if you look at a country like the kingdom, which is 18 million people, with more than 50% of the people under the age of 30, 28. So you need to create the jobs for the next generation. Now, oil and gas is not going to create those jobs. Neither is petrochemicals, because these are capital intensive and not labor intensive things. So you do need to diversify, because idle young men roaming the streets will also not do anything for stability.
Absolutely, driving their Ferraris as well and not paying any tax. I mean, that is a problem. It's indolence, isn't it? Ian, you've studied what is known, I'm sure you have, both of you, so please comment both of you on this, what is known as the 2030 vision, which is Saudi's plan for where it sees itself being in 12 years' time. Do you think it's a sustainable plan? Let me ask you first of all, Ian.
It's a very, very ambitious plan. I mean, Vision 2030, the word vision is appropriate. It is fantastically ambitious. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, is often characterized as a young man in a hurry, and that is very much reflected in what he wants to do. I mean, the key pillars of Vision 2030 are diversification and privatization of the economy, the move away from this dependency on oil, which has been the mainstay of the Saudi economy and indeed most of the rest of the Gulf for the last 60 years, let's say, 60, 70 years. Late 1940s.
Prior to which there wasn't much there at all, really, was there?
Well, what there was there at all.
There were trading areas.
There was pearl diving and nomadic life, but very, very different from the mega cities and the conspicuous consumption that we've come to associate with the Gulf. So Vision 2030 is about transforming the economy of the most important country in the Gulf, the largest country in the Gulf, the most populous one, and the one that, after all, controls still, 30% of the world's known oil reserves.
Is it realistic?
Well, lots of people are skeptical about it, and they think that what he's doing is to set out this grand ambition while leaving to one side the larger issues of implementation. For example, he came up recently, or the Saudis came up recently with this project to build a mega urban zone called Neom. It's an interesting name. The name is a combination of Arabic and English, but it spells out new, novelty, innovation in the north of the Red Sea. The kind of, $500 billion, I think, is the figure. It's those kind of things that are attracting great headlines, but also skepticism about the chances of successful implementation. Never mind the economics, which are challenging enough, but the social
You can tell me about that in a moment.
Political
Sambit
implications of this scale of ambition.
His first thoughts on this. React to what you've heard so far, but then tell me what happens if it doesn't work.
Well, if it doesn't work, the consequences are catastrophic. The problem is, if you think about sort of the political economy of the Saudi society, what you have is a patronage system, and there are different families who benefit from this patronage system, and then these benefits are distributed all across the country.
So the oil income comes in, the king
so
or
oil
whoever it is hands
generates
it
the
out to the people he wants to stay on his side who happen to be members of his family.
Yeah,
mostly.
So oil generates the rent, and then the rent is distributed through this patronage system. So what the Vision 2030 is proposing, this plan, is that you're going to replace the main source of rent, which is oil and subsoil wealth resources, with something else, private sector-led jobs, etc., etc. Now, there the issues are that how do you move from one economy to the other? There are
practical-
micro issues
that's
as well, which sort of addresses the issues raised by
Sambit,
Cornelia.
that is a practical side of it, but what about the implications of it not working? That was the point I was driving at. Why do they desperately need this to work?
Well, the implications of this not working is that it can break down the very fabric of Saudi society. So the society, the legitimacy of the elite, the legitimacy of the government depends on this patronage system, rent distribution, all the public services are dependent on it. So if oil goes and there's nothing substantial to replace it with, then the consequences could be...
You are
quite
desperate,
catastrophic.
Cornelia, to get in, because I would like to lead on from what Sambit has said in just a moment. In Oxford, with the idea of what happens if Saudi society breaks down, what are the implications of that? But you were desperate to jump in.
I was desperate to jump in because I think on one hand, yes, it's very ambitious, it's overly ambitious. And yes, Mohammed bin Salman has been called the crown prince, has been called a brash young man. But sometimes if you have a very conservative behemoth such as Saudi Arabia, in order to move the needle, you need to be overly ambitious. In order to move 1 kilometer, you maybe probably say we need to move 3 kilometers, because if you are not ambitious, nothing will happen. And yes, there are the big mega projects, but then I look at smaller things. I just saw yesterday SAGIA, the Saudi Internal Investment Agency, all investment into the kingdom goes via SAGIA, came out and really streamlined the investment process. So yes, they have the grand vision, but they're trying really underneath to do it. And yes, he's a brash young man, but there was another brash young man. His name was called Ibn Saud. He built the country.
Adeel, let me come to you. We're positing that the plan perhaps doesn't work, and that there is a breakdown in a Saudi society which depends on patronage at the moment. In other words, paying the most influential members of the kingdom to stay on your side. You then have a restless young population, and they don't have jobs. What are the consequences of this not working? If Saudi society starts to crumble, what are we in other parts of the world going to see?
Right. Well, I mean, you have to first recognize that in many of these societies, particularly the likes of Saudi Arabia, oil is the single most important driver of political economy, because it fosters a particular kind of social contract, an unwritten social contract between the rulers and the population, where you purchase political acquiescence in return by actually distributing revenues. So the whole pillar rests on two components: is the redistribution to elites and citizens, and repression. So if this doesn't work, the Saudi rulers will have to increase the scale of repression. And that could be quite problematic. And you should also recognize that the budget deficits have gone through the roof. The gross capital formation has declined by 16%. There are a lot more people trying to enter the labor market, but they do not have simply enough jobs to go around.
Ian, you reported on the Middle East. You're still writing about the Middle East for most of your life. I'm trying to get at what are the dangers to the outside world if Saudi society starts to crumble, and why those other countries that A, surround it, and secondly are larger countries but further away as well, why they would want to see this succeed.
The outside world has every interest in wanting to succeed because of the scale of the issue. Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Gulf, it's the largest economy, it's the largest population. It occupies a strategic position in a very, very sensitive part of the world. We talked about the scale of bin Salman's ambition. There are some people who are critical of his ambition in other areas too. The use of force in the region, the war in Yemen, the sort of language he uses in the Saudi confrontation with Iran. But it's on the domestic front where things are really going to be decided. I agree absolutely with what was just said. There is a fundamental bargain in Saudi Arabia between the ruled and the rulers. The ruled expect the state to look after them. They expect a certain standard of living, of subsidies, of jobs in the state sector. In return for that, they give up what we recognize elsewhere in the world, in the democratic world, as political rights. There are no representative institutions in Saudi Arabia, apart from the odd local council. If bin Salman's project doesn't work, then you will be in a situation, I mean, this is speculation, of course, where expectations have been raised for a bright future, for a very, very young population. The youth bulge is at its most evident in Saudi Arabia. 70% of the population under 30, under 28, something like that. Bin Salman, of course, is that age himself as part of his appeal. He's 31, going on 32, I think. But if these expectations of reform are raised and it doesn't work, then it is an alarming prospect. Now, we don't know what's going to happen, but there's certainly within Saudi society, there are elements which are the very politest reactionary. At the not so polite, they are dangerous people. There are plenty of people who make the connection between the Wahhabi ideology that holds
Very strict
society together in Saudi Arabia and the most extreme forms of jihadi ideology. The Saudis are changing their attitude towards that. They're distancing themselves from it. But those elements are there in a society where expectations are rising, reform has been promised. If it doesn't deliver, then, you know, it doesn't, it's not going to look good.
So you have a country that needs to change. The outside world should possibly, probably, want to see it succeed in those changes. But is it going to be able to turn itself into a Western playground? Does it want to, Sambit? Can it afford not to? What are the difficulties there? How does it make a living for itself if it doesn't use oil?
Well, if you look at it from a pure sort of economic theory point of view, you know, basically you have to look at what sort of inputs are required for industrialization in general, and what inputs Saudi Arabia and the region can offer in order to succeed. If I am a policymaker in Saudi Arabia, I'll look at my neighbors. I'll look at some of the Arab city-states who have successfully diversified. So rather than focusing on manufacturing, I would probably focus more on services.
Financial services in particular when it comes to a country such as Dubai or a city-state.
But you see, when you look at that, that's very true. And you look at your neighbors, and it's good to look at your neighbors, but it's also easier to haul an economy around if you have a very small population and a lot of expats. It's just easier. Here in Saudi Arabia, you have a really substantial population. But I would say from our perspective...
And then let's point out, there is a marginalised side of society, Saudi society.
There's
as well.
absolutely,
absolutely,
absolutely. But you know, the thing is, if you look at it, we, from a Western perspective, we have every interest in this experiment working, because GCC is a beacon of stability.
That is the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Yes, amidst a sea of turmoil. I mean, look,
well,
Iraq,
it's looking slightly less stable these days.
It's looking slightly less stable. Absolutely, and we can also say he probably overreached with regard to Yemen and Qatar and so on.
Which brings us to the other side of this. We said it was principally Saudi, but are there other countries such as Qatar, which has massive gas reserves and is living very well at the moment, but it's isolated from the rest of the GCC countries?
Qatar is a special case. It's so small and it's so wealthy.
So put that to one side in terms of concerns.
I think so.
What about
absolutely? But if you look at the other ones, I mean, you know, you look at Dubai. Dubai was very the Emirate of Dubai was very good in sort of reorienting itself into services, to tourism, and so on. But again, it's a small population. It's easier to do it in a small population.
You had to. I mean, I was first in Dubai at the end of the 90s, beginning of this century, and that was the time at which they were starting to diversify. When their big brother, Abu Dhabi, in many senses, had all of the reserves, and Dubai had very, very few. So it is possible.
It is, but it's much harder in a big country. But let's also be clear: oil will not be gone over very quickly. It is diversify while you still have the oil revenue. We are still foreseeing oil demand to grow until 2040.
Even in the face of the fact that the Americans have become more self-sufficient,
I'm talking about global global
Right,
then
global
countries
such as
oil
China.
demand.
But you have Asia, of course,
Yeah.
you have China.
Yeah,
It's
and
interesting to
it's
see
the
the Saudis in
ISS
particular are working quite hard on the
they're pushing,
relationship
yeah.
with the
Absolutely,
with the East.
and so you see, oil will not be gone, but it is very wise to start something else, and it's also wise to capture the imagination of the young, because you cannot have a very, very conservative society which is totally decoupled from what the rest of the world is doing.
Adeel, in my producer's notes, which were very kindly given to me before the programme, it has next to your name pessimistic, and I don't think that's generally your demeanour, but I mean, in terms of this, is that the way you see it? You don't think it's going to work?
No, I mean, I'm actually, I see this as a process whereby a serious reform intent is being made, right? So a Vision 2030 is a serious reform intent. It's a recognition that there is fire under the feet of the ruler. They need to make reform work. And that many of Saudi Arabia's external partners also want reform to take place. But there's some serious questions about the challenges that this would entail and whether Saudi Arabia is prepared at this particular juncture to deal with those challenges. For example, it's the politics of economic reform. Wherever reform takes place, it creates winners and losers. And you need to compensate the loser, right? And for that, you require new bargaining structures. And what do I mean by bargaining structures? You need business association, you need other kinds of forums where collective interests are articulated, you have concessions, and those are missing. In fact, what we see is a greater centralization of power in Saudi Arabia in one person. That's precisely the opposite of what you need to make diversification work. For diversification,
And indeed, that can lead to a certain form of isolation. But Ian, I see.
there's one more
Sorry, Adeel, we're wrapping up in just a minute, so I have to get around to everybody else. I see you've been making a lot of notes. You're either writing a new book, an article, or you've got something to say on this. So which is it?
I think there's an interesting issue. We talk about how the Saudi economy can be diversified. There's an element that is fascinating, and it's tourism. The potential for tourism in Saudi Arabia, a vast country, a fabulous, largely unspoiled coastline along the Red Sea, vast interior. It's often, mentioned and discussed, and there are plans afoot for developing tourism in Saudi Arabia. But it sounds weird, doesn't it? How will Western tourists operate, function, enjoy themselves in such a conservative environment? And that's exactly the sort of difficulty that's at the heart of all this. You're opening up this country. A part of what bin Salman is trying to do, which we haven't talked about, is to change the status of women, public morality, consents are suddenly taking place. These are all very, very significant changes socially. Now, you put that together with an opening up of the country, attracting foreigners for tourism, for investment. You're talking about huge changes. Can this be done? Are those elements in Saudi society?
Economically rather than societally, do you think it can be done, Cornelia? We're coming to the end.
Economically it can done, but I think societally there are constraints, absolutely. But then let's not forget, Saudi puts on the biggest tourism event in the world yearly. It's called the Hajj.
The pilgrimage.
So that's a very different sort of tourism, but there is at least some core competency.
But let us also not forget that there are a great many tourists around the world who don't want to go on a beer-swilling, semi-naked holiday. There are an awful lot of people who would be quite happy to go to a relatively quiet conservative society. I would.
My point is that it has huge potential, but it's very, very challenging as well, not just in terms of managing it economically. Oman, for example, has done quite well. One of the poorer of the Gulf, the members of the GCC, with a shrinking oil sector, has done quite well, opening up the tourism sector.
Anybody who's listening and want to go there, it's an absolutely stunning country. Where do you think we should be looking to see if signs of this are working?
Well, I mean, let me add something that's not been discussed so far. So this is all happening, opening up, diversification, all of this is taking place in the broader context of broader geopolitical context, which is driven by changing trade patterns. So the thing is that America is soon going to be a net exporter of oil-related resources. Russia is a major exporter of oil. So it's no longer the OPEC which calls the shots. And China is the largest customer of Saudi oil. So in that broader context, Saudi economy opening up, diversification, engagement with the rest of the world, there are other options like the Chinese new Silk Road projects, etc., etc. So in that context, how the Saudi government would steer the economy, that's going to be interesting. That's going to be challenging, but I think I won't write it off.
Time is our greatest enemy. I don't know whether I'm going to overrun, but I'm going to chance it anyway. Adeel, let me ask you the same question I put here, which is what should we be looking for as members of the public to see whether we think this project is working or not?
Right. Yes, I think the IPO that is being issued by Saudi Aramco would be a very key aspect. And I think the big subsidy reforms that have taken place, if they don't lead to mass protests, and if the state is successful in compensating the losers through the citizen card, which will basically allow, a pot of money to be given to these low-income households, and I think attention to detail.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for this edition of Roundtable. It is a changing world, and in many ways this is one of those signs that we'll be looking forward to see whether stability and security as well as wealth and happiness can be maintained in that region of the world, the very volatile Middle East. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.